Hello, and welcome to the launch of the IEA's Global EV Outlook 2023. I'm Jethro Mullen, Chief Editor in the IEA's Communications team, and I'm joined here today by IEA Executive Director Dr. Fatih Birol and the Head of our Energy Technology Policy Division, Dr. Timur Göl, who led the analysis of our new EV report, which is available for free to download on our website, and the content is also fully available online. So during today's press webinar, Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Dr. Göl will present the key findings of the report. We'll then take some questions from journalists. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a 2-minute break right after the presentation for you to submit your questions. And so with that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Jethro, and good morning to all the viewers or the journalists following this press event, and greetings to everybody from the International Energy Agency headquarters. Dear colleagues, I guess more than 2 years ago, I was going to attending a meeting in Italy, a G20 meeting, and before going to that meeting, we were discussing with the colleagues about some numbers on the different parts of the clean energy system: solar, wind, heat pumps, electric cars, and we realized that a new global energy economy was about to emerge, just replacing slowly but surely the existing one, which is based on the traditional technologies. It was some 2 years ago, and today, when we look at the numbers, the penetration of different clean energy technologies, ranging from renewables to heat pumps, from heat pumps to electric cars, I can confirm that a new clean energy economy is emerging, and it is emerging much faster than many stakeholders think, much faster than many policymakers, industry players, investors think today. And I believe it is the job of the International Energy Agency to provide better understanding of the dynamics of the global energy markets. And in that series, we are analyzing the current and the future trends on different parts of the energy system and sharing it with the public, with governments, with industry and others. Now, before going to electric cars, which is the topic of today, I wanted to give you a couple of numbers which I believe would reconfirm what I said. Very strong, fast emergence of a new global energy economy. Solar. Only last year, the solar panel installations around the world increased by 35%, the largest increase in a decade. Many of you may well be aware of the International Energy Agency's net zero pathway to reach our 1.5 degrees target, and the solar penetration is fully aligned with what we have foreseen there. Heat pumps. How do we heat our buildings in a sustainable and secure way? We are seeing a big growth, unprecedented growth in heat pumps. In the United States and in many European countries, the heat pump sales overtook those of traditional gas boilers. China remains the largest market in heat pumps and sees a steady growth as well. Another major candidate is wind, especially offshore wind. You will see, and I am sure we will come with some numbers in the next few months to come. We are expecting a big growth in offshore wind in Europe, China, and United States. So these are some of the numbers that are confirming what IES said 2 years ago, that a new global energy economy, a clean energy economy is emerging. And today we have another very important data point, which is what is happening in the transportation sector with cars, electric cars. We have been looking at this issue since several years. And when I look at our numbers, what happened in the year 2019, only 4 years ago, of all the car sales in the world, only about 2% of all the cars in the world was electric cars, about 2%. And today, in our report today, you will see that this 2% came to, in the year 2023, to 18%. A major, if I may say so, an explosive growth, driven by China in a large part, but also in Europe and other parts of the world. And when we look at the next years to come, even with the existing policies, I want to underline this, even with the existing policies today, in the year 2030, which is tomorrow, in 3 top car markets, China, United States, and in Europe, 60% of all the cars sold will be an electric car. So 60% of all the cars sold in 2030 in China, US, and Europe, top 3 car markets will be electric car. We are seeing the development outside of these 3 largest car markets are rather slower. But I know that India is moving, Indonesia, Thailand, other countries moving, and we may see also rapid expansion of electric cars in those markets. So this is affecting many parts of our economy. One of them is especially I wanted to underline here, is the oil industry. Because when you look at the numbers, about 40% of the global total oil demand today is coming from road transportation. And here, of course, cars have a major role to play. With the trajectory that I tried to describe to you, between now and 2030, a big growth means there will be about 5 million barrels per day avoided oil consumption. I talk about the cars a lot, and we are seeing the huge momentum here, but there is a wave of electrification in other parts of the transportation sector. First with buses. In China, again, China is the leader, but some European countries and others, and perhaps the next chapter would be the trucks. So, therefore, for the heads up to oil industry, when they are thinking of large-scale investments, it might be important to note the developments in the road transportation in terms of its electrification. Maybe another word on the car industry. So we are following the car industry in order to understand what are the implications for the energy and climate context. And I think it is not an exaggeration that the car industry is going through the biggest transformation of the industry since Henry Ford came up with the so-called Model T in early 20th century. So, dear colleagues, this historical transformation in the car manufacturing will have, of course, implications beyond the oil industry, beyond the climate trends. It will have implications for of course, the critical minerals, other technologies, and I will now give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Gül, who and his team, after providing the world with a landmark report, Energy Technology Perspective, which looks at the clean energy technology manufacturing in the world, they come up with another report today looking at the a very important part of our energy and climate questions, namely global EV outlook, to tell us more about this. But I would like to finish my words to say that we are coming different reports, different numbers, and every come the numbers we are coming in terms of the heat pumps, wind, solar, electric cars, nuclear making a comeback, they are all confirming what International Energy Agency has underlined a few years ago, that we are seeing that a new clean global energy economy is emerging. It is important for the governments, for the industry, and for the investors to take note of that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Executive Director. Dear colleagues, welcome to today's launch of the 2023 edition of the Global EV Outlook. As Jethro said earlier, it's a report that is available for free on our website, and it's not only the report that is available for free, but we're also making a data explorer and a policy explorer available for free on our website. So please do make use of that source of information, because I think we're trying to give you as much information on electric vehicles as possible, as we have it available for free. I would like to pick up on what the Executive Director said earlier and go back in time, but even a bit longer back in time, because this year's 2023 edition of the Global EV Outlook is actually exactly 10 years after we released for the first time a global EV outlook. It was not an annual report at the time. It was a report that was established in support of the electric vehicle initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial that the IEA is coordinating since its inception. And this initiative has the objective to bring countries together to foster electric vehicle deployment. At the time, the sales of electric cars were actually very, very low globally, less than 0.5% of total sales, a niche market at best. Electric cars were very expensive, not least the batteries, but several member governments of the Electric Vehicle Initiative set themselves very ambitious targets nonetheless. Collectively, the objective of the member governments was to reach a stock of 20 million electric vehicles on the road by 2020, which we as the IEA translated into a sales expectation of around 6 million cars by that year. Ever since, governments have been pushing hard, actively putting in place a wide range of policies to achieve these targets, policies to improve vehicle fuel economy and bring down emissions, policies to provide financial support for the purchase of electric cars, policies to support the manufacturing of batteries and electric vehicles, or in fact many municipal city-level efforts to incentivize the purchase and use of electric cars. We from the IEA, we have been supporting governments in this endeavor, analytically, of course, tracking progress every year, sharing new analytical insights, examining different policy approaches and how they might play out in practice. And we also regularly convened decision makers under the umbrella of our electric vehicle initiative to foster a global dialogue so that the future of electric cars is global and not just limited to a few countries. Now, the outcome of all these government efforts has been truly impressive. Global sales of electric cars actually exceeded those 6 million that we expected for the year 2020, or by the year 2021. The stock target of 20 million cars was actually achieved in 1 year later in 2022. In some countries, of course, the initial targets were missed. In other countries, these targets were overachieved. But the overall story is that electric cars are not truly at the cusp of a mass market. They are no longer marginal or niche at all. In 2020 and 2022, electric car sales bucked the trend of a sluggish global car market and continue to see increases there. In 2022, sales increased again by 55% at a global level to reach over 10 million cars being sold, accounting for 14% of all the global car sales. The three largest car markets, China, Europe and the United States, together constitute for 60% of all car sales globally, and they are also far and away the largest electric car markets. So what's happening here, of course, will, in terms of electrification, will have repercussions for other countries. China, as you see here very clearly, is the largest market by some distance. 60% of global electric cars were sold in China last year, making up for 29% of total car sales in the country. What this actually means is that the government target to achieve 20% of new energy vehicle sales by the year 2025 was actually already more than achieved last year. Half of the global electric car field on the world's roads is now on the road in China. Europe is the second largest electric car market, with sales increasing by 15% last year. 1 in every 5 cars sold in Europe last year was electric, and in the United States, which has somewhat lagged behind on electric car sales, we saw a strong uptick in sales last year, up 55% over the previous year, reaching 8% of total car sales. Our preliminary figures for this year suggest a continued strong growth. In the first quarter of this year, global electric car sales were actually up 25% relative to the same period of last year. In China, sales were more than 20% higher, in Europe 10%, and in the United States even 60%. So our expectation for 2023 is for this trend of electrification, for this boom of electrification, to continue. Electric car sales to reach 14 million by the end of the year, constituting a share of 18% of all cars that are being sold on global markets. Now, electric cars hold great promise to meet multiple policy objectives. They are often associated with the fight against climate change, and rightly so, of course, but they also reduce oil consumption. Dr. Birol already alluded to that, which is particularly important in countries that are relying on oil imports, and they can address air pollution, of course, which is a pressing concern in dense urban areas all around the world, but in particular in emerging and developing economies. Emerging economies in Asia are particularly exposed to these challenges, and the level of car ownership here is still very low compared to the rest of the world, meaning that there's a lot of scope for growth. The good news here is that electric car sales jumped in 3 very important countries last year: India, Indonesia, and Thailand. These are still very small numbers, but in India, sales of electric cars reached nearly 50,000 last year, about 4 times higher than the year before, and reaching a share of almost 2% in total car sales. So we're at early stages of electrification. China reached an equivalent share in the year 2016, but we can expect sales to continue to grow moving forward, not least because India's production-linked incentive scheme provides subsidy for domestic EV and battery manufacturing, and Indian companies actually are responding. Nearly 90% of electric car sales last year in India came from domestic companies, mostly from the automaker Tata. In in Indonesia and in Thailand, we also saw very strong growth in these countries. The dominating factor was the new presence of Chinese car makers, which was an important driver of these sales in Indonesia. Around 75% of sales were actually from Chinese car makers, and in Thailand, the top 3 best-selling electric cars last year were actually Chinese. Both Indonesia and Thailand are now strengthening their support for EVs, so we can expect these numbers to continue increasing in the next years to come. In other countries, the sales of electric cars are still comparatively low. In fact, when you look at all the rest of the world combined and you compare it to India, Indonesia and Thailand, you see that the car sales were lower in total than in these 3 countries alone, the electric car sales. But of course, many car manufacturers are operating globally, and so supportive policy action can help boost sales in these countries that are lagging behind today. So electrification is reaching car markets in Asia in particular, and there are many obstacles, of course, that have to be overcome, from high purchase prices to infrastructure, etc. But the outlook is nonetheless very bright. It's important to note here for Asia in particular that electrification of personal mobility is not necessarily something that is new to the region. Personal mobility in these countries is often more geared towards motorcycles and other small mobility options, in particular in urban areas, because they're just cheaper to buy and cheaper to operate. And in these segments, electrification is already quite advanced in some countries in Asia. In fact, when you look at the share of electric vehicles in the sales of 2- and 3-wheelers, it's actually very comparable with that of electric cars today, and it's dominated, as you see here, by countries in Asia. China is the largest market. Around 45% of all 2- and 3-wheelers sold last year in the country were electric, compared with the 29% for cars. This is not a recent effort at all. This goes back to the year 2010 around, when many cities, including Beijing and Shanghai, started limiting or even banning conventional motorcycles, including to address air pollution, boosting the electric alternative. India here is the second largest market. Around 55% of 3-wheelers in particular sold in the country last year were electric, compared with the just 2% that I mentioned earlier for cars. In fact, in India, the top EV company by revenue in India was actually Ola, which does not sell any electric cars at all so far, but only motorcycles. And Vietnam, also a very good example, where motorcycles are the predominant mode of transport, had 10% of motorcycles being sold last year in the country being electric, most of them manufactured by domestic companies. In other modes of road transport, such as buses and trucks, sales are still low today, 5% across all bus segments on aggregate, and just over 1% for all truck sales, again very much centered around China. But it's important here to recognize that these high-level figures mask some very significant progress that has been achieved in some areas. For buses, many national and local governments have committed to reducing emissions from public transport. In these cases, electric bus sales are actually significantly higher. In Finland, for example, electric buses accounted for over 65% of sales in the last year, and in China, the number was around 20%. Trucks are very much the next frontier of road electrification. The specificities of truck operations pose challenges here for batteries, but more electric truck models became available last year than in all of the previous years combined. Some 100 new models of medium and heavy duty trucks, indicating that truck manufacturers are increasingly gaining confidence in supplying larger, heavier, zero-emission models with greater payloads. And important here to recognize it's an overhaul of the car industry, truck industry, 2-wheelers industry, but it's also very important to watch for oil markets. Road transport today accounts for more than 40% of global oil use, of which half is from passenger cars and the other half is actually from trucks, commercial vehicles and buses. So success in electrifying these will have profound implications for global oil markets. This brings me now to our expectations for the outlook for electric cars, and if there's anything to learn from the experiences with electric car sales over the past decade that I mentioned earlier in my talk, then it's 2 things. One, setting targets for electric cars is the first part of a transformation, and such targets often look very, very ambitious and hard to achieve in practice at the time when they are being announced. But, and that's the second lesson here from the past decade, in the case of electric cars, they should absolutely be taken seriously. Over the past decade, certainly, governments have shown that they follow up with policy on their targets, policy implementation, step by step, year by year, because policy is ultimately what matters for these markets to become, move out of niches to mass markets. The outlook here is not short of ambition at all. Many countries have formulated net zero emission targets for mid-century, and in that context have put forward very ambitious targets, either to phase out the sales of internal combustion engine vehicles or to achieve 100% sales of zero-emission vehicles, often as soon as 2035. On aggregate, this would require electric car sales to reach 40% by 2030. Our expectation in last year's edition of the Global EV Outlook was that the share of electric cars could reach 22% in 2030 on the basis of all the policies that were in place at the time, so still some gap to these targets. But things have evolved very quickly over the past year, and so we have made three very important revisions to our outlook in the United States: Inflation Reduction Act, adoption of California's new zero-emission vehicles regulation by a number of states is projected to deliver the 50% market share for electric cars by 2030, in line with the national target. European Union adopted new CO2 standards for cars and vans that are aligned with the goals set out for 2030, meaning we are expecting 60% of sales to be electric by 2030. In China, subsidies for electric cars are actually being phased out, but local support and market fundamentals remain very strong. These cars are generally cheaper and competitive with internal combustion engine cars in China already today, compared with many other markets. This leads us to expect a market share of 60%, more than 60% of sales by the year 2030 in China. As a result, we are expecting collectively for these three markets a 60% market share, and at a global level, because many other countries still have to put in place their policies, 35% sales share by the year 2030. The implications of such a transformation, I mentioned that earlier, of the passenger market are very far-ranging for the car industry and its associated supply chains, but also for oil markets. Passenger cars constitute, as I said earlier, roughly half of global oil demand for road transport and have been a source of demand growth for oil for decades, but electric vehicles are set to change exactly that. We estimate that the amount of oil that can be displaced by electric vehicles by the year 2030 is around 5.2 MBD, predominantly through the use of electric cars. There are many uncertainties here in the outlook, of course, for electric cars. There always are, that's clear. On the downside, of course, there are uncertainties on the economic outlook, whether policy support gets sustained as markets grow and get larger and larger, whether such mass markets can actually be reached, whether infrastructure can keep pace with policy ambition for electric car sales, and much more. But there's just as much, if not more, reason to be even more optimistic on the outlook for electric cars than what current policies and government targets actually suggest. And such reason for optimism comes from the developments that we're seeing in the industry across different parts of the supply chains. We have been tracking announcements for car manufacturers around the world over the past couple of years and what they might mean for the number of electric cars that could be sold by the year 2030. These targets have increased a lot in recent years as many car manufacturers have put forward their electrification strategies, and they suggest now that electric cars could make up for around 40 to 55% of total car sales by the year 2030, which is actually very close to the 60% that you need to achieve globally in order to be on track for our net zero by 2050 pathway, certainly well above the level that is implied by current government policies as well as current government targets. Many car manufacturers are actually looking to massively, if not fully, electrify cars in the next 1 or 2 decades, and we can expect smaller and cheaper electric cars already by the year 2025 to come to the market, making them more affordable to consumers in the car market. Of course, ambition on the car industry is one thing. Whether the entire electric vehicle supply chain can be built up on time is another. But here too, there is good news coming from industry announcements. If you look at batteries, there were about 1.6 terawatt hour of manufacturing capacity in place globally, with the expansion announcements that have been made by the battery industry until now, until end of March. Actually, this number could reach close to 7 terawatt hours by the year 2030, equivalent to what is actually required to align with a global EV sales share of 60% by that time. As I said earlier, there's much to be done, of course, to build up the required supply chains and investing in expanding and securing critical mineral supply, as well as in alternative battery chemistries, which can contribute to tempering critical minerals demand on the one hand, and also more effectively serve heavier vehicle segments will be particularly important here. But the outlook for electric cars is certainly very upbeat, with implications for the car industry, just as well as for oil markets and our collective ability to meet climate goals. Thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Jethro.
Thank you, Timur, for the presentation. We now have some time to take questions from journalists. So we invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom, if you haven't done so already. And we do encourage you to mention your media outlet along with your question where possible. So we're just going to take a 2-minute break to give you a chance to enter questions, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you very much to the journalists for all the questions. We've got a lot of very good ones and we're going to get through them as quickly as we can. The first couple, I think we're going to sort of split them up between Dr. Birol and Dr. Göll. We have one on the numbers in this year's report. Why are your projections for EV sales more optimistic now than they were a year ago? And we also have one that I think Dr. Birol is probably well placed to take that question. And we have one from Peter Campbell of the Financial Times. Is public adoption of EVs now decoupled from the need for government subsidies? If not, when will this happen? So the first question on what's changed in a year to Dr. Birol.
So a very good question. In fact, first of all, I can tell you that as International Energy Agency, we are very happy when we revise the clean energy technologies penetration upwards. And this is another example in that direction. Why we have revised up our expectation is because governments did change their policies, and some of the targets they put in action, which are followed by real policy actions or financial incentives. A big chunk, of course, a big driver of the upward revision comes from the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives a very strong support for the car industry in terms of the electric cars in the United States, but also in Europe. The new legislation in Europe gave an additional boost, and also China is going from strength to strength. I wanted to bring to everybody's attention that there are different drivers of why governments are now accelerating action on clean energy, especially in the electric cars. It is not necessarily and exclusively driven by the climate or environmental concerns. This is, of course, a key issue, but there are two other drivers here why governments come up with these new policies and new mandates. One of them is the industrial policy. Many governments around the world see that the next chapter, for example here, of the car industry is the electrification. So they want to prepare their industries ready for the next chapter of the industry sector. This is second one, in addition to environmental concerns. And the third one is, especially for the electric cars, the oil security. The more geopolitical tensions we see around the world, the more we are experiencing the signals from the oil producers, this or that way, gives many countries, for example China, to increase the electrification in the transportation sector and slow down the penetration of oil products. So in sum, governments are changing their policies when we believe they are serious and they are supported by the right actions, legislations, mandates, financial incentives. We are revising up our numbers. Thank you.
Yeah, now on the second question from the Financial Times on the subsidies, how we're seeing this developing. I think there are two trends to watch here. One is what's happening in China, and as I said in my presentation, in China, subsidies are being phased out for these type of new energy vehicles, whereas in other markets they're still prevalent, Europe, United States, we are still providing such subsidies for the purchase of electric cars. This is an important area to watch, of course, for governments. If there's any lesson from the past that we have seen with renewables, I think it's important to always calibrate how much financial support you're providing to these technologies, because of course the costs fall. The point here is, of course, at which point may electric cars reach or reach not price parity, and that's a very complex discussion to be held. On the one hand, we've seen last year in particular how prices for batteries were pushed up by increasing prices of critical minerals. At the same time, we're now seeing, as prices for critical minerals are dropping, that this can change very, very quickly. So we have to observe how this plays out in the longer term. Pricing strategies by automakers will be very complex, and so it's important for governments to watch how actually costs fall vis-a-vis the prices of the cars falls, because it's not only a matter of costs here. Branding, competitive positioning, etc. will play a big role. Our current expectation is that we can see price parity in North America and European markets somewhere around the mid-2020s. Purchase price parity has already been achieved in small car segments in China, where battery prices are themselves lower and small electric cars tend to have smaller batteries, making them more affordable for the larger cars, which are an important option in the American as well as the European markets. SUVs, pickups, purchase price parity is likely to come later, probably towards the 2030s.
Thank you very much. Well, we're getting a lot of questions, so we're going to get through as many as we can before we run out of time. We have one on the oil sector. What impact is the rapid growth of EVs going to have on the oil industry? Then we have another question from Florence Jones of Power Technology, coming back to a bit to the critical minerals issue that Timo was just speaking about. With global EV sales growing year on year, how can global supply chains account for growing demand of critical minerals and rare earth materials? And somewhat linked to that, there's a question from Victoria Waldersee of Reuters asking about affordability. So linking a little bit to the question of cost parity with conventional cars. Many people today can only afford a used combustion engine car because prices fall so much after use. But given the high value of batteries and the potential for second life and reuse, it seems unlikely that the value of an EV will fall anywhere near as much as an ICE has done over its lifetime. How do you expect this to impact take-up of EVs? So maybe Dr. Birol can take the question on the oil industry, and then Timur can speak about the critical minerals and batteries elements. So Dr. Birol, over to you.
Thank you. So, as I said, the road transportation, namely cars, trucks, and buses, constitute about 40% of global oil consumption today. And we are seeing that there is a very strong wave of electrification, now started with the electric cars, moving to buses, and maybe the next chapter for trucks. Looking from the oil industry point of view, especially for the oil consumption and gasoline and diesel, this is an important signal to take note of. We are, of course, aware that there is also another important driver of oil demand globally, which is petrochemical. Still, we need oil for that. We also have jet fuel for the aviation. Sustainable aviation fuel needs a lot of work to do. But the picture, when I look at the picture, this different dynamics of the global oil demand, I see that there is a very strong growth on the road transportation, a bit slower on the others, but they may well give strong signals to the oil industry about the future pace of oil demand. Not today immediately, but in the next few years we will see more and more. And the oil industry always needs long lead times for investment decisions. Therefore, I believe this is a very strong, my recommendation, data point for them to consider. One last thing, Ejete, if I may here, we know that some parts of the oil industry would like to see oil prices as high as possible, taking steps this or that direction to push the prices up. And I can tell you that this may well be another driver of the faster acceleration of electric cars, which will help the economics of electric cars, and at the same time will give an additional reason to governments to speed up in terms of implementation of their targets. So I think the oil industry need to take this also into account. Thanks.
So I have two questions to cover and very little time left, as I'm being told, so I'll try to be very brief. Now first, from Power Technology on the global supply chains and the impact on critical minerals demand. There are two strategies here. One is the demand side strategy, the other one is the supply side strategy. On the demand side, of course, tempering critical minerals demand through better battery designs, new battery designs. We're seeing this in China already happening, in several European countries, as well as in the United States, looking into these kind of options to minimize demand for critical minerals, at the same time supporting battery recycling. These are important strategies on the demand side. On the upstream side, of course, investment is the critical word here. We are seeing some of that investment already coming. Over the last year, a significant amount of investment took place in lithium supplies, so hopefully this will moderate the outlook. It's not a question of availability, it's a question of making the investments on time. As regards the second question from Reuters, in fact, it had another element that I would like to pick up on, which is about diversifying transport away from vehicles or not, or do we imagine a 1-to-1 replacement of electric cars. So generally speaking here, some of the questions about affordability of electric cars in the second-hand market are still to play out. We will yet have to see how the second-hand market develops. Everything here is early data points, so whether or not electric cars will be in the second-hand market more or less affordable than internal combustion engine vehicles is still to be seen. At the moment, of course, we are just entering the first wave of these type of second-hand markets, so it's a bit early stages, and we'll need to see how this plays out. But of course, what speaks against it also speaks in favor of electric cars, which is there is a higher value of an electric car potentially in the second-hand market that is available. But on the question of one-to-one adoption, we are not advocating just a purely electric vehicle transition in our net zero by 2050 roadmap. In fact, we have shown that both electrification as well as modal shifts, changes in behavior, are both critical factors to achieve climate goals, as well as to make our cities more livable. So we are not suggesting here that this is a desired outcome just to replace one vehicle by another, but policymakers will need to find more integrated solutions here that are in line with modern mobility concepts for urban areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Birol just wanted to add one point.
Just to add what Timur said, from IEA point of view, sustainable public transportation is something that we can suggest to all of the viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol and Timur. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Lots of great questions. Thank you very much. More questions that we could squeeze in. We've already gone over time. If any journalists do have questions that didn't get answered during the Q&A, please follow up with the press office and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. As a reminder, the full report is available for free on the website. Do please take a look. Thank you and goodbye.